At 1 minute past midnight, Eastern Time on August 19th, 2026, a 50% tariff quietly went live on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods. No press conference, no dramatic signing ceremony broadcast live. Just a line in the Federal Register, turning from theory into law, hitting everything from cement bags to hockey sticks, from dairy powder to bedroom furniture. Somewhere in Ottawa, government phones had been ringing for days. Somewhere in Washington, trade lawyers had already run their tariff calculators 100 times. And somewhere between those two capitals, Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump had just gotten off the phone with each other for the second time in 24 hours, according to Carney's own office, with no details released about what, if anything, had actually been agreed. This is the story of how a trading relationship that has lasted for nearly a century arrived at this exact moment, and why the answer Canada gave back may end up mattering more than the ultimatum itself. To understand why this deadline mattered so much, you have to go back more than a year to the earliest days of this trade fight. It didn't start with 50% tariffs. It started smaller, and it started personal. In the spring of 2025, the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs tied to concerns about fentanyl trafficking across the northern border, alongside a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports, and a separate 25% tariff on automobiles and trucks not built inside the United States. Canada, under its newly installed Prime Minister Mark Carney, responded the way Ottawa almost always responds to an American tariff. It matched it. 25% retaliatory tariffs on U.S. autos that didn't comply with the Continental Trade Agreement. 25% on a long list of other American products. Carney was blunt about it at the time, telling reporters that Canada would defend its workers, even as he acknowledged the fight would be long and there was no quick fix available. To put that first round of tariffs in context, it's worth remembering just how unusual it was for Washington and Ottawa to be trading tariff blows at all. For roughly 3 decades, since the original North American Free Trade Agreement took effect in the 1990s, and later through its successor, CUSMA, the two economies operated on the basic assumption that trade between them would stay largely open, predictable, and shielded from the kind of tariff warfare Washington sometimes waged with other trading partners. Canada is not a minor player in this relationship either. It has long ranked among the largest single trading partners of the United States, with an integrated manufacturing base, particularly in autos, that sees parts and finished goods cross the border repeatedly before a single vehicle is finished. That deep integration is precisely why a 50% tariff lands so differently on Canada than it might on a country with a more distant trading relationship with the US. It doesn't just tax finished imports sitting on a shelf. It disrupts supply chains that were built over decades around the assumption that the border would function almost like an internal state line. That first round set the tone for everything that followed. By July of 2025, with a partial trade framework still unresolved, Trump escalated again, this time with a letter. Not a diplomatic cable, not a formal notice through trade channels, but a letter posted directly to Trump's social media platform, addressed to Carney, threatening a 35% tariff on Canadian products unless a deal was reached by August 1st. The letter warned that if Canada retaliated further, whatever percentage Canada raised its own tariffs by would simply be added on top of the 35%. Carney's office confirmed receiving the letter. Carney himself said Canada remained committed to negotiating, while also announcing publicly that Ottawa was working to diversify its trading relationships beyond the United States. That August 1st deadline came and went without a comprehensive agreement, and importers were left doing exactly what businesses are doing again right now, recalculating landed costs and wondering which shipments to accelerate before the next cutoff. Here's a detail that often gets lost in the noise. Not every one of Trump's tariff moves against Canada survived legal scrutiny. In February of 2026, Canada's Supreme Court struck down a separate set of tariffs that had been justified on fentanyl-related national security grounds, delivering an unexpected legal win for Ottawa. It didn't end the broader tariff dispute. The steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs remained fully in place. But it demonstrated something important. This fight was not simply a matter of a Trump issuing threats and Canada absorbing them. There were real legal, political, and economic constraints operating on both sides, even if they didn't always show up in the headlines. That same stretch of 2026 also saw Ottawa make a notably conciliatory move of its own, one that showed the relationship wasn't purely a one-way escalation. Canada dropped many of its retaliatory tariffs on the United States, with the change scheduled to take effect on September 1st. Carney framed the decision as recognition that Canada had, in his assessment, secured a comparatively strong position relative to other countries negotiating with Washington at the time. Notably, Canada kept its 25% tariffs on U.S. autos, steel, and aluminum firmly in place, even while dropping the broader list, a signal that Ottawa was willing to make targeted concessions on secondary irritants while holding firm on the sectors it considered strategically essential. A White House official told NBC News at the time that Canada's move was long overdue, while stopping short of announcing any reciprocal American concession. The announcement followed a phone call between Carney and Trump that Carney's office described as productive and wide-ranging. The first known call between the two leaders, since an earlier round of negotiations, had failed to produce a deal ahead of the original August 1st deadline the year before. Both leaders reportedly agreed to reconvene, setting the stage for the CUSMA review and eventually the Section 338 escalation that would follow. By the summer of 2026, attention shifted to a different kind of deadline, one written directly into the text of the Continental Trade Agreement itself. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, known as CUSMA in Canada and USMCA in the United States, includes a mandatory 6-year review clause. July 1st, 2026 marked exactly 6 years since the deal came into force, and under Article 34. 7, the three countries were required to indicate whether they wanted to extend the agreement for another 16 years, out to 2042, or allow it to continue under a rolling annual review process instead. This was never a hard cliff-edge deadline in the way headlines sometimes made it sound. CUSMA doesn't simply expire if nobody signs anything. It remains legally in force regardless right through to 2036, unless one of the three countries gives 6 months formal notice of withdrawal. But the symbolism of the date was enormous, and Washington used it to send a message. According to a statement, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer gave directly to CTV News, the United States confirmed it would not agree to renew CUSMA in its current form. Greer's statement was precise. The agreement was not being renewed as written, though it would remain in force while the two sides worked through what he called the deal's shortcomings and trade deficits. Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, had spent months publicly downplaying the deadline's importance, describing it in earlier remarks as something closer to a checkpoint than a cliff. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, meanwhile, had told Canadian broadcasters that Ottawa absolutely wanted CUSMA preserved intact. When July 1st arrived, Carney himself set expectations low ahead of the trilateral call, telling reporters in Coujouac, Quebec, that he wasn't expecting any drama and wasn't looking for his pen. He was right that nothing dramatic happened that day. What happened instead was slower and in some ways more consequential. A continental trade relationship that had operated for 6 years under a fixed, predictable framework shifted into a period of open-ended, year-by-year uncertainty. It's worth understanding why the CUSMA review even carried this much weight in the first place. Under Article 34, 7 of the agreement, the three countries only had 2 real options on the table: agree unanimously to a full 16-year extension, pushing the deal's expiry out to 2042, or decline that extension and fall back into a pattern of mandatory annual reviews for the remainder of the agreement's original 16-year term, which runs through 2036. Trump had signaled his position well before the deadline arrived, telling reporters earlier in the year that he believed the United States would be better off without CUSMA altogether, and that he wasn't looking to renew it. Trade law experts, including Greta Peisch, a former general counsel for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, had predicted exactly this outcome in comments to Global News, saying the Trump administration was expected to withhold agreement to a straightforward renewal in July. This CUSMA backdrop matters enormously for understanding the August tariff standoff, because it means the dairy, alcohol, and mislabeled motor vehicle tariffs didn't emerge in a vacuum. They landed just weeks after Washington had already signaled it wanted the entire continental framework renegotiated on its own terms, making the 50% tariffs look, to many Canadian officials, less like an isolated dispute over specific sectors, and more like a pressure tactic aimed at the much larger renegotiation still to come. That uncertainty didn't stay abstract for long. 19 days after the CUSMA review deadline passed on July 20th, 2026, Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations that would define the next chapter of this fight. Each proclamation invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a legal authority so rarely used in modern trade policy that multiple law firms tracking the announcement noted this was effectively the first time it had been deployed this way in the current era. Section 338 allows a president to impose tariffs when a foreign country is found to be discriminating against American commerce. Trump's administration used it to target 3 specific sectors: dairy, alcoholic beverages, and a category formerly labeled motor vehicles that, despite the name, contained almost no actual cars. According to legal analysis published by the firm Holland & Knight, that so-called motor vehicles list instead covered electronics and telecom equipment, furniture and home goods, building materials like lumber, plywood and cement, plastics and packaging, clothing, footwear, luggage, toys, sporting goods, machinery, cosmetics, and agricultural products, such as flowers and seeds, well over a dozen distinct industries bundled under a misleading heading. The dollar figures attached to these proclamations were significant, but not enormous in the context of the overall Canada-U.S. trading relationship. According to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the tariffs were projected to affect close to $20 billion in annual Canadian imports, spread across roughly 554 separate tariff lines. Crucially, the measures carved out specific exclusions. Energy products, potash, fish, and certain critical minerals were left untouched, according to reporting, confirmed by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business's own tracking of the tariff lists. That exclusion of energy would later become politically significant in its own right, because it meant Ottawa couldn't easily point to energy exports as an obvious retaliatory lever, even if it wanted to. What made these particular tariffs land so hard on Canadian businesses wasn't just the 50% rate. It was the fact that they applied, regardless of whether a product technically complied with CUSMA's rules of origin. Ordinarily, goods that meet the Continental Trade Agreement's compliance standards are shielded from many tariff actions. Not here. According to the law firm Blake's, the White House framed the proclamations as a direct response to what it characterized as Canadian discrimination against American products in the auto, dairy, and alcohol sectors, pointing specifically to Canada's own 25% retaliatory surtax on non-compliant American vehicles, first imposed back in April of 2025 as Canada's countermeasure to Trump's original auto tariff system. In other words, this was round 3 of a tit-for-tat sequence that had been building for well over a year, each side pointing to the other's prior retaliation as justification for its own next move. The effective date was set for August 19, 2026 at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time, precisely 30 days after the proclamations were signed, giving both governments a full month to either negotiate a resolution or prepare for impact. Legal and logistics firms began publishing detailed guidance almost immediately. One trade compliance advisory noted that a shipment leaving Canadian soil on August 18th, but arriving or being formally entered into the U.S. market after that midnight cutoff would still be hit with the full 50% duty, meaning companies had to work backward from realistic arrival timing, factoring in border congestion and carrier schedules, rather than simply working forward from when a truck left the loading dock. For businesses operating on thin margins, that kind of timing precision suddenly became existential. The reaction from Canada's business community was immediate and unusually blunt for an industry association that normally chooses its words carefully. Dan Kelly, president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, told CNBC that a 50% tariff essentially makes a product uneconomic to sell into a particular market. Full stop. Kelly said many of his organization's members, and the CFIB represents roughly 103,000 small businesses across Canada, indicated the new tariffs could grind their American sales to a complete halt if they were actually implemented. He added that some businesses were already seeing U.S. buyers hold off on placing future orders simply in anticipation of the new duties, meaning the damage was arriving before the tariffs even technically took effect. Kelly specifically noted that these Section 338 measures cut differently than earlier rounds of tariffs, because so many of the targeted products were small business and consumer-facing goods rather than heavy industrial inputs. Politically, the tariffs also exposed real divisions inside Canada itself, divisions that complicated Ottawa's ability to present a unified negotiating front. One of the specific American grievances behind the alcohol tariffs involved provincial liquor boards, removing American wine, beer, and spirits from store shelves as an earlier act of retaliation. As the August 19th deadline approached, Ottawa began weighing whether to have provinces lift those bans as a goodwill gesture, but the provinces themselves didn't agree on the right approach. Ontario indicated it would only lift its ban on American alcohol if it also received relief on separate auto and steel tariffs affecting its manufacturing base, refusing to give up leverage for free. British Columbia went further, stating flatly it would not lift its ban under the terms being discussed at all. Adding another wrinkle, Ontario's own domestic wine and craft beverage producers had seen genuine commercial upside from the ban, with Ontario craft wineries reporting a 60% year-over-year sales increase during the period American alcohol was off the shelves, meaning any provincial decision to reverse course would create real winners and losers inside Canada's own borders, not just across the border with the United States. It's also worth noting that Canada's trade relationship with the United States doesn't exist in isolation from its dealings with the rest of the world, and that broader picture has occasionally complicated the Ottawa-Washington relationship in its own right. Reporting has noted that Canada's recent trade agreements with China raise concerns among American officials, wary of any sense that Ottawa might be hedging against its reliance on the U.S. market by deepening ties elsewhere. At the same time, Canada formally repealed its digital services tax in March of 2026, having already suspended it back in June of 2025, a policy the Trump administration had specifically objected to as discriminatory against American technology companies. That repeal was widely read as a genuine concession from Ottawa, offered in the hope of smoothing the path toward a broader deal, even though it did not, on its own, prevent the Section 338 tariffs that followed months later. Taken together, these moves show a Canadian government trying to signal flexibility on secondary irritants, digital taxation, some retaliatory tariffs, provincial alcohol rules, while refusing to bend on what it considers the core pillars of the relationship: steel, aluminum, autos, and dairy. Against this backdrop, the final stretch before the August 19th deadline played out like a slow-motion countdown, with negotiators shuttling between Ottawa and Washington in what both sides publicly described as an intensifying effort. Canada's negotiating team was led by Dominic LeBlanc, the minister responsible for Canada-U. S-Trade, alongside Chief Negotiator Janice Charette. On the American side, the primary counterparts were U. S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. According to CBC News, LeBlanc and Charette met with Greer and Lutnick in Washington in the days immediately preceding the deadline, the third such meeting between the two negotiating teams in as many weeks. After one of those sessions, LeBlanc posted publicly that the two sides remained committed at the negotiating table and were continuing to work diligently to advance and defend Canadian interests, adding simply that the job wasn't done yet. Sources briefed on the private side of those talks told CBC News something that never made it into any official government statement. Canadian negotiators had reportedly argued forcefully to their American counterparts that there would be no political appetite among Canadians to keep negotiations going at all if the August 19th tariffs actually came into force. That's a striking claim if accurate, because it suggests Ottawa was using the domestic political cost of the tariffs themselves as a bargaining chip, essentially warning Washington that implementing the threat could backfire by hardening Canadian public opinion against any future deal, rather than softening it. According to industry sources cited in that same reporting, the Canadian side indicated a willingness to offer movement on some of the underlying American complaints, particularly around alcohol and dairy quota structures, even as broader disagreements over autos remained unresolved. Carney's own public language throughout this period offers a window into how Ottawa was trying to walk a genuinely difficult line, projecting strength for a domestic audience while keeping the door open for a deal. Bloomberg reported that Carney had repeated one specific pledge many times over the preceding year, that Canada will not accept a bad deal. It became something close to a mantra. At the same time, Carney also said publicly that he doesn't see the value in using Canadian energy exports as leverage in the trade talks, a notable statement given that energy was one of the few major sectors the Trump administration's tariffs had deliberately excluded, and given how much political pressure Carney faced from some corners to use Canada's energy relationship with the U.S. as a more aggressive bargaining tool. He chose not to. In the final 48 hours before the deadline, the pace of direct communication between the two leaders themselves picked up sharply. According to CTV News, Carney spoke with Trump by phone on Monday, August 17th, in a conversation the Prime Minister's office confirmed took place but declined to characterize beyond saying it concerned ongoing trade negotiations. The two men spoke again the following afternoon, Tuesday, August 18th, with the Prime Minister's office again offering no further detail beyond confirming the leaders discussed the state of negotiations. On the same day, Carney used a French-language public appearance to describe the talks as very intense and delicate, while adding that Ottawa had plans in place to, in his words, cover all eventualities if the sweeping new tariffs went ahead as scheduled. That phrasing, cover all eventualities, was deliberately vague, and deliberately so because Carney had also said days earlier that he believed it would be counterproductive to announce any retaliatory response in advance of the tariffs actually taking effect. Trump's own public comments in the run-up to the deadline sent a very different signal, and it's worth being honest about that contrast, rather than smoothing it over. Ahead of a separate trip to Scotland earlier in the broader dispute, Trump told reporters directly that he didn't expect to reach a trade deal with Canada, adding that the two countries hadn't had a lot of luck together and suggesting Canada might simply end up as a country subject to a flat tariff rather than a negotiated arrangement. According to Fox Business reporting cited by CNBC, Monday night's phone call between the two leaders did not convince Trump to hold off on the tariffs scheduled to take effect at midnight. The White House did not respond to CNBC's request for comment on the state of talks. Meanwhile, when a CTV News camera crew caught USTR Jameson Greer walking past the Department of Commerce in Washington in the final hours before the deadline, he declined to answer questions about how the negotiations were progressing at all. It's important to be precise here about what is confirmed and what remains genuinely uncertain, because this is a live, unresolved story rather than a finished one. As of the tariff's effective date, no comprehensive trade agreement between Canada and the United States had been publicly announced. The 50% tariffs on the dairy, alcohol, and mislabeled motor vehicles categories took legal effect at 12:01 p.m. Eastern Time on August 19th, exactly as scheduled in the July 20th proclamations, according to multiple legal trade advisories tracking implementation. Whether a last-minute framework was reached in the closing hours, whether the tariffs took hold with talks continuing in parallel, or whether Canada moved toward some form of retaliation, is not something that can be stated as settled fact here. It was still developing at the time this account was assembled, and viewers should treat any claim of a final resolution with appropriate caution until it's confirmed through named verifiable government statements from Ottawa and Washington directly. What is clear is the scale of what's riding on the outcome. In a statement released the Monday before the deadline, one Canadian business-aligned voice noted that the country's negotiators had the full support of industry in securing an agreement that would lift tariffs and duties weighing on the steel, aluminum, lumber, and automotive sectors the statement said affect the livelihoods of 2.6 million Canadians directly. That figure gives some sense of why this dispute reaches so far beyond trade ministries and tariff schedules into everyday Canadian communities built around manufacturing, forestry, and cross-border supply chains. An economic analysis from Desjardins, one of Canada's largest financial institutions, estimated the tariffs would impact approximately 28 billion Canadian dollars, or roughly 19.8 billion US dollars, worth of annual Canadian exports to the United States. About 5% of everything the U.S. imports from Canada in a typical year. Desjardins also flagged a subtler risk beyond the direct trade numbers, that the sheer uncertainty generated by these repeated tariff cycles could dampen business confidence and curb investment plans across the Canadian economy, independent of whatever the final tariff rate ends up being. The provinces most exposed to this particular round, according to that same analysis, are Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. Not coincidentally, the same province is home to much of Canada's auto manufacturing, dairy production, and cross-border trade infrastructure. Ontario in particular carries a disproportionate share of the exposure, given its deep integration with American auto supply chains, where parts can cross the Canada-U.S. border multiple times before a vehicle is fully assembled in a plant in Ontario or Michigan. That integration, incidentally, is exactly why Carney's government chose not to place tariffs on auto parts when it first retaliated against Trump's original vehicle tariffs back in the spring of 2025. Officials in Ottawa said at the time they understood the benefits of that tightly interwoven production system and didn't want Canadian countermeasures to damage it unnecessarily. Quebec's exposure runs through a slightly different channel than Ontario's. Its aluminum smelting industry sits directly in the path of the steel and aluminum tariffs that predate this latest round by more than a year, while its aerospace and manufacturing sectors depend heavily on predictable cross-border shipping timelines that repeated tariff deadlines have made anything but predictable. British Columbia's exposure runs through forestry and softwood lumber and irritant in the Canada-U.S. relationship that goes back decades, long before Trump's current term, and one that continues to simmer in the background of these tariff fights, even when it isn't the specific product line making headlines on any given week. That regional variation helps explain why a national government trying to negotiate a single unified deal with Washington has to simultaneously satisfy provinces with genuinely different economic interests. An auto-heavy Ontario, a resource-heavy British Columbia, an aluminum and aerospace Quebec, all while keeping its own domestic coalition intact enough to make any eventual agreement politically survivable back home. Zooming out from the day-to-day tariff mechanics, there's a broader economic picture worth including here, because it helps explain why Carney has staked so much political capital on holding a firmer line than some of his predecessors might have. Reporting compiled by The Hub, drawing on trade data through 2025 and early 2026, found that Canadian exports to the United States fell 5.8% in 2025, a decline nearly offset by a 17.2% jump in exports elsewhere, though much of that gain reflected a surge in gold shipments rather than genuine diversification into new markets. As a result, the American share of total Canadian exports fell to 71.7%, its lowest level since the early 1980s. That same period saw Canada slip into a brief technical recession, spanning late 2025 and early 2026. Inflation climbed to 3.2% by May of 2026, and youth unemployment reached 13.4%. Carney has repeatedly said that no realistic, fair deal has yet been offered to Canada, even as his government simultaneously pursues closer integration with Washington on one hand, while telling audiences in Beijing and at Davos that Canada needs to build economic resilience against great power pressure on the other. A genuinely difficult balancing act that critics on different sides of Canadian politics have both seized on for different reasons. There's also a longer institutional clock running quietly in the background of all of this that's easy to lose track of amid the daily tariff headlines. Because the July 1st CUSMA review deadline passed without a formal 16-year extension, the agreement is now legally locked into a cycle of annual reviews for as long as it remains unresolved, rather than the fixed 6-year rhythm it operated under previously. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra told The Hub in an interview that this renegotiation process, given how page by page and granular it is, could realistically stretch out until 2027 before any lasting resolution is reached. That timeline matters enormously for how this current dispute over dairy, alcohol, and misnamed motor vehicle tariffs should be understood, not as an isolated flashpoint, but as one visible skirmish inside a much longer, structurally unresolved renegotiation of how North America's three biggest economies trade with each other for the next decade. So where does that leave things right now at the moment this account was put together? The 50% tariffs are, as of the confirmed effective date, the law of the land for the specific categories they cover, unless a subsequent announcement has reversed, paused, or replaced them, which was not confirmed at time of research. Carney has said publicly on more than one occasion that everything is on the table if an agreement can't be reached, while also saying he saw no value in reaching for energy as a retaliatory tool and no benefit in responding before the tariffs actually took hold. Trump, for his part, has alternated between signaling openness to further deals and openly questioning whether Canada is a country the United States can reach much of a deal with at all. Both leaders spoke twice by phone in the final 2 days before the deadline, according to Carney's own office, and neither government has said publicly what, if anything, moved as a result. Before wrapping up, it's worth being straightforward about what remains contested or simply unverified in this story, because that honesty matters more than false certainty. Exactly what was discussed on those final 2 phone calls between Carney and Trump has not been disclosed by either government, and any account claiming to know the private substance of those conversations should be treated skeptically. Whether Canada's negotiators actually delivered the blunt warning about political appetite reported by CBC's sources has not been confirmed on the record by any named Canadian official. It remains sourced to unnamed industry contacts and government sources speaking on background. And critically, whether the August 19 deadline ultimately produced a negotiated framework, a straightforward implementation of the tariffs with talks continuing regardless, or some form of Canadian retaliation, is a live developing situation rather than a closed chapter. And viewers should look to primary statements from Ottawa and Washington directly for the most current confirmed outcome. The information gathered here draws on reporting and legal analysis from CTV News, CBC News, BNN Bloomberg, CNBC, Bloomberg, the BBC, Global News, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, and trade law advisories published by Blakes, Wiley and Holland and Knight, alongside economic analysis from Desjardins and reporting from The Hub, all named checkable sources, cross-referenced against each other wherever their reporting overlapped. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about how this relationship between two of the world's most deeply connected economies actually gets resolved. So it's worth subscribing to stay with this story as it develops in the coming days, because the next confirmed statement out of Ottawa or Washington could change the entire picture. If this breakdown of the tariff timeline helped you actually understand what's happening instead of just reacting to another headline, drop a like so more people trying to make sense of this dispute can find it too. And if you have a genuine read on how this ends, whether you think Ottawa holds its line, whether you think Washington eventually blinks, or whether you think both sides settle for a messy partial deal that satisfies no one completely, leave a comment and share your reasoning. Because the range of informed opinion on this among people actually watching it closely is wider than you'd expect. So here's the honest, open question this leaves us with. Trump built his entire approach to Canada on the threat of an ultimatum, a hard deadline, a punishing tariff rate, and the implicit bet that Ottawa would eventually fold rather than absorb the economic pain. Carney built his entire response on the opposite bet, that Canada could withstand short-term damage to its exporters rather than accept terms it considered unfair, while quietly working to reduce its economic dependence on the American market over the longer run. Both of those bets can't fully pay off at the same time. Which one do you think is actually working based on what you've seen play out so far? I'll leave that with you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.